It began on a humid, moonless night on a small, nameless ridge deep in the jungles of the Pacific, where the air itself seemed to breathe with fear, sweat, and the quiet hum of unseen insects. A night where every shadow could hide a bayonet, and every whisper of wind could mean death. For hours, the U.S. Marines had been waiting, their bodies pressed against the damp earth, their fingers clenched around rifles that felt heavier with every heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the enemy was moving. They could hear them, faint, rhythmic, coordinated. The sound of boots crunching leaves, metal brushing against branches, and the soft, low murmur of men preparing to kill. The Marines' orders had been clear. Hold fire. Let them come closer. It was madness, or so it seemed. Because in every war before this, soldiers were told to fire as soon as they saw the enemy, to keep them at a distance, to never allow them to breach the line. But this time was different. This time, the Marines had learned something the hard way, that fighting the Japanese in the jungle was not like fighting in Europe, or the deserts of Africa, or even the open beaches of Tarawa. These weren't battles fought with distance and precision. They were fought face to face with the enemy inches away, silent until the very last moment. And so the Marines waited, watching the tree line flicker with movement, the moon glinting off steel helmets and bayonets that looked almost ghostly in the dark. The new recruits among them, boys barely out of high school, wanted to shoot, to scream, to do something, but the veterans, the ones who had seen Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and the first brutal weeks of Okinawa, whispered the same three words that every man in the Pacific would come to understand. Not yet. Wait. For the Marines, this wasn't just a tactical choice. It was survival. Because by letting the enemy get close, dangerously close, they could unleash a devastating counterattack at point-blank range, turning the Japanese tactic of surprise infiltration against them. The Japanese were masters of the night. They had studied how to slip between the lines, how to crawl through tall grass or drag themselves silently through mud for hours, only to rise and strike with a scream and a grenade at dawn. But this time, the Marines were ready for them. They had learned from the massacres at Alligator Creek and the chaotic hand-to-hand fights at Tenaru that there was no stopping the Japanese with long-range fire. The jungle absorbed bullets, sound, and light. The enemy moved like ghosts, so they let them come. 50 yards, 30, 20, 10, until they could smell the sweat and hear the breath of men who believed they were about to overrun an American position. And then, with one whispered command, the night exploded. Machine guns opened up from dug-in positions. Trip flares burst to life, painting the jungle in eerie blue and orange light. Grenades arced through the dark like falling stars. The first wave of Japanese soldiers never even had time to scream. They were caught in a perfect crossfire. The Marines had arranged their guns not in a straight line, but in overlapping arcs that turned the ground before them into a kill zone. Within minutes, the clearing became chaos. Smoke, fire, and the smell of burning oil mixing with blood and dirt. The Japanese kept coming, driven by fanatic belief, crawling over the bodies of their fallen comrades, screaming, "Banzai!" as they charged into certain death. The Marines, disciplined and unyielding, fought with terrifying calm, moving, reloading, shouting orders over the roar of automatic fire. Every man knew his role. Every weapon had its field of fire. And above the thunder of gunfire came a strange, chilling sound, the steady click of bayonets being fixed. Because once the ammo ran low, it would come to that, knives, shovels, and bare hands in the dark. Hours passed, though to those in the fight it felt like a single, endless second of madness. When the first rays of dawn finally broke through the jungle canopy, the Marines looked out at the field before them and saw a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. More than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies piled in grotesque waves, tangled in barbed wire and cratered earth. Not one had made it through. The Marines had lost a few dozen men, brave, unflinching souls who had held the line when the enemy was close enough to touch. But what stunned the survivors most wasn't the number of dead or even the victory itself. It was the silence that followed. A silence so heavy it seemed to crush the soul. For a moment, every man stood still, their hands trembling, their ears ringing, their eyes staring at the devastation they had created. They had done what had seemed impossible. They had turned the Japanese obsession with close combat into their own weapon. By letting the enemy get too close, they had taken control of the battlefield, rewriting the rules of jungle warfare in blood and fire. And as the smell of cordite drifted through the humid morning air, one Marine sergeant, his uniform soaked in mud and sweat, muttered words that would become legend among his unit. They thought they were closing in. They never knew they were walking into hell. But this was only the beginning. What happened that night would change everything. The tactics, the training, the very mindset of every Marine who fought in the Pacific. Because from that moment on, every man who went into battle knew. Sometimes victory doesn't come from keeping your distance. Sometimes it comes from standing your ground and waiting, motionless, until the enemy is close enough to feel your breath before you strike. And as new intelligence poured in, revealing just how the Japanese planned their suicidal charges and infiltration tactics, Marine commanders realized that this brutal close-range defense had done more than win a single battle. It had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. The myth of the unstoppable Japanese night assault was broken. The Marines had shown the world that fear could be turned into fire, patience into power, and silence into the deadliest weapon of all. If the first night proved the tactic worked, the second proved it was no accident, that what the world would later call the doctrine of silent discipline wasn't born out of desperation, but of design, forged in the heat of fear and perfected in the darkness of the jungle. After that first engagement, word spread quietly across the Pacific, not through orders written in ink, but through whispers carried from foxhole to foxhole, from sergeant to private, from one bloodied survivor to another. Don't shoot until they're right on top of you. It sounded suicidal to anyone who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the tremor of the earth beneath the crawl of hundreds of Japanese troops moving as one organism, or seen the glint of steel only 10 yards away. But for those who had seen the miracle of that night, who had watched the impossible happen when they waited just one heartbeat longer, it became gospel. And as the Marines moved from island to island, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, from Peleliu to Okinawa, the doctrine evolved, refined by sweat, terror, and the unrelenting calculus of survival. The Marines began studying every detail of Japanese night attacks, the timing, the formation, the rhythm of the charge. They noticed how Japanese units would probe the lines first, 2 or 3 men crawling ahead, sometimes naked except for grenades strapped to their chests, to test for mines or to draw fire. If a Marine fired too soon, even one rifle shot could reveal an entire position, and within seconds, mortars would rain down with deadly precision. But if they stayed quiet, if they let those shadows crawl right up to the wire, they could lure the entire attacking force into a trap of their own making. Soon, Marine engineers began to reinforce this deadly patience with science. Interlocking fields of fire, overlapping arcs, kill zones calculated by compass and map. Barbed wire placed not to stop, but to delay, to tangle the enemy just long enough for the gunners to cut loose. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but every time they screamed, "Banzai!" and charged into the dark, they were running straight into the jaws of a machine built on American discipline and Japanese predictability. In the humid madness of the jungle, order became the deadliest weapon. The Marines learned to control their breathing, to steady their hands even as the ground shook with approaching footsteps. They learned to count the seconds between explosions, to identify enemy movements by the faintest crack of a branch. Some even learned to sense the attack before it began, an instinct born from nights spent on the edge of life and death. And with each engagement, the tactic became more lethal. At Cape Gloucester, when the Japanese launched a furious night assault under the cover of monsoon rain, the Marines lay silent in flooded foxholes, rifles above the water, grenades lined up. Like prayer beads, the enemy came so close that one Marine later swore he could smell the sake on their breath before he gave the signal. A single whisper. Now. In seconds, the jungle turned into an inferno. Tracers carved red lines through the rain. The Japanese screamed and fell, slipping in mud and blood as the Marines fired from 3 angles at once. When it was over, more than 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies half submerged in the waterlogged earth. The Marines lost only a handful, but what none of them could forget was the sight of the survivors, dazed, crawling forward even as they bled out, still clutching grenades, still trying to reach the line. The sheer fanaticism of the enemy shocked even the most hardened veterans. It taught the Marines something that would shape the rest of the Pacific War, that courage without reason could be as predictable as fear, and that predictability could be turned into a weapon. As intelligence officers studied reports from across the islands, they began to understand that the Japanese doctrine of night assault was both brilliant and doomed. It relied on shock, on terror, on the belief that Americans would panic when faced with sudden close combat. But the Marines were no longer panicking. They were waiting, calm, methodical, and deadly. They knew the screams were coming. They knew the flares would light up the sky. And when they did, they were ready. Some called it controlled slaughter. Others, more poetic, called it the quiet storm. But to those who lived through it, it was simply survival. At Saipan, a Marine lieutenant who had fought at Guadalcanal turned his foxhole into a laboratory of death, wiring trip flares to cans, setting grenades on hair triggers, and aligning his Browning machine gun so precisely that it could sweep the entire approach with one continuous arc of fire. He didn't sleep for 3 nights, waiting for the assault he knew would come. And when it did, when hundreds of Japanese soldiers stormed his position under the full moon, his line didn't break, it sang. The gunfire was so constant that his men later said the barrels glowed white-hot, turning the air around them into a shimmering haze. At dawn, they counted over 900 bodies in front of their position, stacked in layers like waves frozen in mid-motion. The lieutenant wept, not from guilt but from awe, because he knew what this meant. They had not just survived, they had mastered the night. Word of these engagements filtered back through command channels, and soon the doctrine was being taught officially in briefings and field manuals. "Let them come close," the officers said, "close enough to count their eyes. Then make it count." It was a strange kind of courage, not the courage to charge forward, but the courage to stay still, to listen, to wait, to feel the enemy's breath and still hold your fire until the perfect second. It went against every instinct a man had in battle, yet it worked with terrifying consistency. The Japanese, so sure of their moral and physical superiority, began to falter. Their officers grew desperate, ordering even larger charges, convinced that more men and more noise could break through. But it only fed the trap. Every island became another lesson, every battle another experiment in precision killing. The Marines, for all their toughness, began to see the tactic not just as necessity but as art. The art of patience, the art of silence, the art of ending a battle before it truly began. And when they gathered after each fight, exhausted and hollow-eyed, they would look at each other and say the same thing. It worked again. Yet beneath that grim satisfaction lay a deeper truth, that each victory carried a piece of their humanity away with it. To look another man in the eyes, to wait until he was close enough to kill you, and then to pull the trigger. It changed something inside. It was no longer war at a distance. It was war stripped to its bones. And though they didn't know it then, that night-fighting doctrine, born of necessity and blood, would echo in Marine training manuals for decades to come. Because what the Marines discovered in those jungles wasn't just a tactic. It was a truth about warfare itself. That sometimes the deadliest move isn't to attack or defend, but to wait, perfectly still, until the enemy mistakes your silence for weakness. And in that moment, you own the night. By the time the Marines reached Okinawa, the final brutal proving ground of the Pacific War, the doctrine of "let them get close" had evolved into something far beyond a tactic. It had become instinct, burned into the nerves and sinews of every man who had survived the islands before. The veterans of Guadalcanal and Tarawa carried that lesson like a sacred secret, a ritual of silence passed down to the green recruits who still trembled when the jungle went quiet. The Japanese didn't know it, but every step they took toward those foxholes was a step into a design so coldly calculated it bordered on supernatural. The Marines had learned to weaponize patience itself. Under the dim, ghostly glow of the Okinawan moon, they dug in not with fear but with focus, measuring fields of fire, aligning claymores and mortars by compass, whispering distances like prayers, 50 yards, 30, 10. Their hearts beat slow. Not from calm, but from control. Every pulse a countdown to the inevitable scream that would break the night. In those suffocating hours before the attack, the world seemed to stop breathing. Frogs stopped croaking. The wind itself seemed to vanish, and in that void, every sound carried like thunder. A twig snapping, a breath drawn too sharp, the faint rustle of movement just beyond sight. Then it came, the low, guttural chant that every Marine had come to dread and anticipate in equal measure. Tenno Heika Banzai! The cry of devotion, of madness, of inevitability. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of Japanese soldiers charged through the darkness, bayonets gleaming, eyes wild, driven by a code that refused surrender. But what they couldn't see, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the Americans weren't running. They weren't panicking. They were waiting. In those moments, time fractured. Seconds stretched like hours. The Marines felt the tremor of boots through the earth, the vibration of massed bodies cutting through the mud and brush. They could smell the sweat, the gun oil, the fear, both theirs and the enemy's. Yet they did not move. They held their fire until the first shadows broke through the wire, until the first grenade landed harmlessly in the mud, until they could see the whites of their eyes. Then came the command, barely a whisper but enough, "Now!" And the night exploded. Muzzle flashes tore the darkness apart in jagged bursts, lighting the charging soldiers like figures caught in lightning. The machine guns roared, tracers stitched the air in burning red ribbons, and mortars blossomed like hellfire among the advancing ranks. The noise was beyond comprehension, a living wall of sound that shook the jungle to its roots. For minutes that felt eternal, the Marines fired without pause, the barrels of their Brownings and M1919s glowing like molten iron. When it was over, the air was thick with smoke and steam, the ground carpeted with the dead. The Marines didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just stared into the fading flashes, hearts pounding, knowing the silence would not last, because the Japanese always came again. They came crawling, wounded, clutching grenades, whispering prayers as they tried to close the distance. And again the Marines waited. It became a ritual of endurance, not just physical, but psychological. The test wasn't who could shoot faster, but who could hold their nerve longer. To a man, they discovered that the human mind could adapt to horror if it meant survival. The jungle, once an enemy itself, became an ally. The vines, the mud, the mist, all cloaked them in invisibility. They learned to count shots by sound, to track attackers by echo. Snipers began to exploit the chaos, picking off officers, sowing panic among the Japanese ranks. And when the attacks faltered, when the bodies stopped moving, the Marines would move silently among the fallen, collecting weapons, dragging ammunition back to their lines, and readying for the next wave. Every night was the same, predictable yet still terrifying. They began to sense the pattern. First, the shouting, then the sprint, then the quiet. It was during that final silence that the real battle began, the waiting between attacks, when imagination was the enemy. The Marines described hearing phantom footsteps, seeing figures that weren't there. Some swore the jungle whispered. But they held firm, because they had learned something the Japanese had not, that fear could be tamed, shaped, even aimed like a rifle. The closer the enemy got, the calmer they became. It was paradoxical, a reversal of every instinct. But it worked. Their commanders noticed the change, too. Reports from Okinawa described Marine units that remained silent and deadly under pressure unmatched in modern warfare. In one after-action report, a captain wrote, "They got within 10 yards before we opened up." It wasn't courage. It was precision. That line became legend. It wasn't courage. It was precision. It summarized an entire philosophy of war. The Japanese had expected chaos. They found choreography. They thought the Americans would flinch. They found statues in the mud, cold and unmoving until it was too late. As the battle dragged on, even the enemy began to sense the futility. Prisoners captured later spoke of it with awe and terror. The Americans, they did not fear the dark. It shattered a myth that the Japanese had built their empire on, that Westerners could not stomach close combat. The Marines had not only matched them, they had surpassed them, turning silence into supremacy. When the war ended and the veterans returned home, many couldn't sleep unless it was silent. Some would wake at the faintest noise, hands twitching for rifles that weren't there. Others couldn't stand fireworks or thunder. The waiting had rewired them, made them creatures of stillness. But even those haunted by it knew one thing for certain: it had saved them. And as historians later dissected the Pacific campaigns, they would come to recognize the doctrine not as a product of luck, but of evolution. The Marines had looked into the heart of the enemy's strength, his aggression, and found the patience to let it destroy itself. In the end, it wasn't just firepower that wiped out 800 men in a single night. It was restraint, the unbearable calm before the storm. And as the last shot faded into the humid night, one Marine scrawled in his journal with shaking hands, "They thought we were afraid. We just learned to wait longer." By the time the U.S. Marines reached Saipan, word of their eerie calm had spread like wildfire through both armies, whispered in the trenches, in the palm forests, and even among Japanese officers who once believed that American soldiers lacked the spiritual courage to face death up close. The phrase, "they wait for you," became a ghost story told among Imperial troops preparing for night assaults, a chilling warning wrapped in disbelief. To the Japanese, the idea that an enemy would allow their entire charge to close within mere feet before opening fire seemed insane, almost suicidal. Yet the Marines' unwavering discipline had turned that madness into method. On Saipan's ridges, that legend became reality again. The night was thick with fog and rain, the kind of tropical mist that clung to skin and muffled every sound, turning the jungle into a cathedral of dread. The Marines, crouched in muddy foxholes lined with wet sandbags, listened as the wind carried the distant rhythm of boots sloshing through puddles. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Above, tracer rounds arched like falling stars, their glow fading into the black canopy. Every man's heartbeat synced to the whisper of command radios, short bursts of static punctuating the air like drum beats. Then the order came through, soft but steady: "Hold fire." The Japanese came screaming through the mist, bayonets flashing, voices hoarse from shouting, "Banzai!" But the jungle did not answer. No shots fired. No movement. The attackers stumbled through wire and debris, confused, expecting panic and gunfire. Instead, they found silence. Then, from the mist itself, death erupted. Machine guns hidden in overlapping arcs tore into the flanks, crossfire slicing through the formation with surgical precision. Grenades rained down from unseen hands. The Marines, nearly invisible in their mud-streaked camouflage, moved like ghosts, their muzzle flashes brief, controlled, never wasting a bullet. Every sound had purpose, every shot was placed with mathematical cruelty. The Japanese fell by the dozens, still shouting, still pushing forward, driven not by reason but by the Bushido code that refused retreat. But that code meant something it could not defeat: patience. The Marines no longer feared the charge. They had studied it, dissected it, learned its rhythm. They knew when the screams would start, when the pace would quicken, when the formation would tighten. And they had adapted. For every 800-man charge, only a handful ever returned to tell the tale. Those who did spoke of the horror with trembling voices. The Americans did not move. They did not shout. They just waited. It was psychological warfare at its purest form, not propaganda, but experience. The Japanese began to attack earlier, in daylight, desperate to avoid the suffocating dread of the night. But that only made them easier targets. Marine snipers and artillery spotters coordinated with chilling precision, transforming open fields into killing zones. In command tents, officers compared after-action reports in disbelief. One noted that the enemy no longer rushes to glory, they rush to their deaths. And yet, despite the carnage, the Marines did not boast. there was no joy in it. For every victory came the knowledge that restraint, the thing that saved them, could just as easily break them. To sit motionless, waiting for the sound of an approaching scream, demanded a kind of discipline that no drill sergeant could teach. It was learned only through survival, through staring into the darkness night after night until fear itself became routine. Historians would later call this psychological conditioning one of the most overlooked achievements of the Pacific War. The Marines had, through necessity, transformed their bodies and minds into living weapons of patience. The Japanese could not comprehend it because to them, courage was measured by action. The louder the charge, the greater the honor. To the Marines, courage became the silence before violence. Every engagement, every night spent waiting in the humid dark, added another layer to the legend. Soon, Japanese scouts began reporting eerie details, the sound of whispering voices that cut off the moment they were close, the occasional flicker of movement that disappeared when pursued, the way machine guns seemed to know exactly where to aim before the charge even began. Some even claimed that the Marines could see in the dark, that they had iron eyes capable of piercing the mist. The truth was simpler but no less terrifying. It was training, coordination, and an unshakable understanding of timing. The Japanese were fighting men who had learned to master stillness, who could control even their own breathing under the weight of impending death. On Saipan's blood-soaked hills, those lessons reached their apex. During one night assault, the Japanese broke through the first wire, stormed within 20 yards, and for a moment it seemed the Marines had been overrun. Then the line erupted in coordinated fire so intense it illuminated the entire ridge, a curtain of red and gold that burned the night away. When dawn came, the field was a graveyard. Over 700 enemy bodies lay scattered, their bayonets glinting in the rising sun. Reporters who arrived days later described the smell of cordite and rain mixing with the salt air, the ground so churned with mud and blood it looked like raw earth had bled. One Marine, when asked how they survived, answered simply, "We just waited for them to come close enough to make it count." But the story didn't end there. The legend of the waiting Marines spread beyond the Pacific. Intelligence officers intercepted Japanese communications referencing the silent death squads, a term coined by survivors of the WWII charges. They spoke of how Americans no longer fought like Westerners, that they had become something else, something primal and unshakable. Even Japanese officers began to dread the night, fearing the silence more than the gunfire. And as the campaign dragged on, the Marines used that fear. They began to stage fake camps, empty foxholes with recorded sounds of movement, luring charges into ambushes. They let the enemy's aggression devour itself. And every time it did, another page of history turned red. When the final battles came, Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Japanese still charged. But it was no longer the same. Their cries were thinner, more desperate. The Marines no longer needed to prove their nerve. They had already redefined what nerve meant. Too close became a mantra, a quiet acknowledgement that proximity was power. The closer the enemy came, the more certain their fate became. In that paradox lay the brilliance of the doctrine. Turn the enemy's greatest strength, his willingness to die, into his greatest weakness. And when victory finally came, when the Pacific fell silent, the veterans looked back and realized what they had done. They hadn't just survived, they had reshaped warfare. The art of waiting had become a weapon deadlier than any rifle. It was precision born from terror, discipline forged in sleepless nights, and courage measured not in how fast a man could charge, but how long he could stay still. When dawn broke over the shattered beaches of Saipan, the world finally began to understand what the U.S. Marines had done in the darkness, and why the Japanese could never comprehend it until it was too late. The strategy of letting them get too close was no accident, no fluke of courage or desperation. It was a deliberate, terrifying calculation born from weeks of observation and blood. The Marines had discovered something profound, that in the chaos of the Pacific, where every hill and palm grove became a maze of smoke and fire, the key to survival wasn't how many bullets you fired, but when you fired them. By allowing the Japanese to believe they were breaking through, the Marines turned every assault into a funnel, every scream into a signal. The enemy's confidence, that wild, suicidal courage fueled by centuries of Bushido, became their own undoing. What began as a defense became a form of psychological manipulation, a trap so effective that even battle-hardened Japanese officers began questioning their own men's loyalty to the cause. The pattern was the same: silence, approach, confusion, annihilation. Marines huddled in foxholes whispered their timings like prayers, counting heartbeats, feeling the ground tremble under the weight of approaching feet. They could smell the oil and sweat on their enemies before the first rifle cracked. The closer they came, the stronger the Marine line became, because that was when control took over. The Japanese thought they were seizing momentum. In truth, they were stepping into pre-registered kill zones that overlapped like invisible nets, woven with fire and steel. The tactic reshaped entire nights of battle. Japanese commanders would plan massive charges, their men fueled by rice balls, sake, and the promise of glory and death. But they did not know that Marines had mapped every possible approach with eerie precision, every ravine, ridge, and gap in the coral. They used illumination flares and signal rounds like conductors leading a symphony of destruction. Mortar teams could drop shells with pinpoint accuracy, while Browning machine guns created curtains of bullets so tight that entire platoons vanished before taking 5 steps into the open. And yet, the most shocking part was the silence before it all. The void that made the Japanese believe the Americans were afraid. They mistook discipline for fear, stillness for weakness. It was a fatal misreading, one that cost them thousands of lives. Marine officers had drilled it into their men's minds. Don't shoot the first man you see. Wait until you can see the whites of their eyes. Make every bullet count. The result was horrifying efficiency. When the Japanese broke through the brush, bayonets gleaming, expecting chaos, they met gunfire so sudden and synchronized that it erased entire formations in seconds. It was not war in the traditional sense. It was controlled extermination, the cold edge of modern tactics meeting the ancient spirit of sacrifice. As reports of these massacres reached Japanese high command, disbelief turned to dread. How could an enemy so seemingly brash and loud master the art of silence? Why were their night assaults, once the pride of the Imperial Army, turning into bloodbaths? Intelligence officers tried to decode it, theorizing that the Marines had developed new listening devices or possessed superior night vision. The truth was far simpler. The Marines had learned to see with their ears. They had memorized the tempo of footsteps, the rhythm of shouting, the subtle difference between an advancing line and a flanking maneuver. Their battlefield instincts had evolved into something primal and terrifying, a sixth sense honed by exhaustion, caffeine, and trauma. Many Marines could tell how far away a charge was by the echo alone, adjusting their aim before the enemy ever appeared. They'd crouch behind sandbags, rifles ready, sweat running down their necks, waiting for that one distinct sound, the moment when the enemy believed victory was near. That was when they struck, unleashing a storm that turned courage into carnage. The effect on morale was devastating. Survivors of these battles described hallucinations, hearing phantom gunfire in the silence, believing the Americans could predict their every move. Entire Japanese units began to hesitate before nightfall, their legendary bravery cracking under the psychological weight of anticipation. In diaries later recovered from the battlefield, Japanese soldiers wrote of nightmares in which the jungle itself came alive, whispering, watching, waiting. They began to suspect the Marines were not men but demons of war, invisible until they chose to kill. One note found on a dead officer read, "They let us come close because they know we are already dead." That line would echo through history as both confession and prophecy. What made the Marines' approach even more terrifying was how emotionless it appeared. They did not shout, did not gloat, did not celebrate. They fought like machines, moving from one kill zone to the next with eerie precision. Psychologists after the war would study this mindset, how soldiers could endure such sustained restraint without breaking. and conclude that the Marines had achieved a collective state of detached aggression where instinct overrode emotion. They were not numb. They were focused beyond the limits of fear. Each man trusted the one beside him with an almost spiritual conviction. That trust, that unity, allowed them to do the unthinkable, to sit in darkness and listen to death coming closer, 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 and wait until the moment was right. Meanwhile, the Japanese command's attempts to adapt only deepened the trap. They tried crawling assaults, staggered advances, even fake retreats. But every new tactic only provided the Marines more data, more patterns to exploit. They studied body language, the pace of movement, even the timing between war cries. Within days, they could predict an entire attack based on a single shout. This predictive precision became so effective that Marine officers started orchestrating their defenses as if conducting a theater performance. Let them pass the first trench. Open fire on my mark. 2 seconds after they stopped screaming, drop mortars. Every order was timed down to the heartbeat. It wasn't improvisation. It was choreography. And in that choreography, the Japanese ceased to be soldiers. They became actors in a death script they didn't. No, they were performing. The result was a psychological collapse that historians rarely discuss, the breaking of the Bushido spirit. On islands like Saipan and Tinian, captured prisoners, rare as they were, began admitting that morale was gone. The old belief that death in battle was glory no longer held meaning when death came from nowhere, when your final moment was a flash in the dark. Even fanatical officers began to question whether honor still existed in a war where the enemy refused to play by old rules. To the Marines, this was the ultimate victory, not just in territory, but in the mind. They had shattered the myth of invincibility, and yet the toll on the Marines themselves was immense. Many veterans would later confess that waiting was worse than fighting, that the silence, the heavy, endless silence before each charge, was more terrifying than the attack itself. Some began to tremble in anticipation. Others couldn't sleep for days, haunted by phantom footsteps and imagined whispers. The discipline that saved them also scarred them, embedding in their minds a pattern of fear and control that lasted long after the war ended. They became masters of patience in combat, but prisoners of it in peace. When asked years later how they endured, one Marine answered, "You stop thinking of them as people. You start thinking of them as sound, and you just wait for the right sound to stop." By the time the Pacific Campaign reached its brutal climax, the tactic of controlled proximity had become doctrine. New recruits were trained not just to shoot, but to wait. Officers drilled them to hold their breath as the enemy charged, to feel the earth shake, to resist the instinct to fire too early. Manuals even included timing charts based on distance and terrain. What had begun as a desperate adaptation had evolved into a refined science of psychological dominance. The Japanese no longer feared bullets. They feared the pause before the bullets came. And that pause, that weaponized stillness, defined the Pacific War in ways few could imagine. It turned raw courage into futility. It turned the jungle into a theater of death where silence itself became the loudest sound. Night fell like a shroud of judgment over the blackened ridges of Saipan, the air thick with smoke, fear, and anticipation. And in that silence, history reached its most haunting turning point. The Marines who waited in the trenches that night knew what was coming. They could feel it in the pulse of the earth, in the vibration of the sand under their boots, in the faint, distant rhythm of feet that moved not with stealth, but with purpose. The Japanese were coming again, not as soldiers in formation, but as a tidal wave of flesh and fury. 1,000 voices chanting, crying, screaming for death, believing that to die in a single charge was more sacred than to live in retreat. What they did not know was that the Marines had turned that belief into a weapon. The plan was in motion, a deliberate, chilling trap that would be remembered as one of the most brutal demonstrations of tactical patience in the entire Pacific War. The order was simple, whispered through the dark, "Hold fire. Let them come." It defied instinct, reason, and sanity. But every man in that line had learned that hesitation was power, that timing was survival, that the deadliest weapon in war was not the rifle, it was discipline. They lay silent as the jungle itself seemed to crawl forward, branches breaking, boots squelching in the mud, guttural roars growing louder until the very air quivered. The Japanese were almost upon them, so close that the Marines could smell the metallic tang of their bayonets, could see the wild glint of eyes lit by distant flares, and still, no one fired. The first grenades arced through the darkness, hissing as they landed short. Still the Marines waited. One heartbeat, two, three, then came the command, and a single word shouted like thunder, "Now!" What followed was not battle. It was eruption. The entire ridge exploded into blinding fire, machine guns roaring in synchronized bursts, mortars raining steel, flamethrowers spewing liquid infernos that turned night into day. The Japanese ranks disintegrated before they could even comprehend what was happening, their forward momentum shredded by the cold precision of calculated chaos. In seconds, the charge that was meant to overwhelm became a slaughter that would echo through military history. As the smoke rose, the scale of what had happened became clear. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers annihilated within minutes, their bodies piling atop one another in grotesque silhouettes under the eerie orange light of the fires. The Marines, their ears ringing, their hands trembling, stood over what looked less like a battlefield and more like the aftermath of an earthquake. But beneath that grim victory was something deeper. The realization that the tactic they had mastered, the art of letting them get too close, had evolved into something far greater than survival. It had become a doctrine of control, a demonstration that patience could defeat fanaticism, that calculation could destroy chaos. For centuries, warriors had believed that the first to strike held the advantage. The Marines had rewritten that rule. They proved that in modern war, victory belonged to those who could resist the urge to act, until the perfect second to unleash hell. The night after the slaughter, a strange quiet settled over the island. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of disbelief. Marines sat in their foxholes, staring into the flames, some weeping, some praying, others simply numb. They had seen war before, but never like this. Never so sudden, so absolute. A few tried to count the dead, but the bodies blended together, their uniforms scorched, their weapons twisted into shapes that barely resembled steel. Officers moved through the lines, checking for survivors, their boots crunching on debris that had once been men. One lieutenant whispered, "This isn't war, it's execution." Yet even he knew that what they had done had saved thousands of American lives, that the trap had worked exactly as intended. But the cost, the psychological toll, would follow them home. Many of those men would never again sleep through a thunderstorm without waking in panic. They would never again hear silence without remembering the moments before the storm. In Tokyo, the news of the Saipan massacre sent shockwaves through the Imperial Command. The High Command refused to believe the reports at first. How could so many die in a single night? How could the Americans, known for their frontal assaults and brash tactics, fight with such cold precision? Japanese officers debated whether it had been luck, terrain, or some secret weapon. But as reports from Tinian, Palaleu, and Iwo Jima followed, the pattern became undeniable. The Americans had mastered timing itself. They no longer fought war as a contest of bravery, but as an equation of inevitability. Their patience had become more terrifying than any bomb. In the weeks that followed, Japanese soldiers began to break from their commanders' orders, hesitating before launching their famous banzai charges, their faith in Bushido cracking under the realization that death no longer brought honor, only futility. One captured sergeant confessed under interrogation, "They make us believe we are winning, then they erase us in an instant." What made the Marines' method so devastating was not merely its efficiency, but its adaptability. On every new island, from Guam to Okinawa, they refined the same core principle: study the enemy's rhythm, absorb his fury, and strike only when he exposes his heart. It was as if the Marines had become mirrors, reflecting the Japanese's aggression back upon them. By the end of the war, military analysts would label it controlled proximity engagement, but to the men who lived it, it had no name. It was survival, pure and brutal. In their minds, it wasn't strategy. It was instinct born from horror. And yet, from that horror, a new form of warfare emerged, one that would shape the doctrines of small unit tactics for generations to come. Modern Marines still study those nights, the way silence was weaponized, the way patience became as lethal as firepower. The psychological mastery behind the tactic went beyond battlefield awareness. It was rooted in human understanding. The Marines had learned that fear could be redirected, that if you could hold fear in your chest, contain it, delay it until the moment of release, it became energy. The Japanese poured their fear outward in suicidal charges, trying to conquer it through sacrifice. The Americans held it like a coiled spring, releasing it only at the precise instant when it would cause maximum destruction. That difference, the control of fear, was the hidden factor that decided battles long before the first shot was fired. And yet, as the war dragged on, that control came with a price. Many Marines would later admit they had grown too good at waiting, too good at killing in silence. After the war, when they returned home to quiet suburbs and gentle winds, the stillness they once relied on began to terrify them. The silence that had once meant readiness now meant memory, the ghosts of footsteps approaching in the dark. Some described hearing phantom chants at night. Others would flinch when their children ran up behind them unexpectedly. The discipline that had saved them on Saipan became the curse that followed them through peace. In letters written years later, one veteran confessed, "I can still hear them. Not their screams, their footsteps. I still wait for them to get too close." And perhaps that is the real legacy of that night. Not just the 800 Japanese who died, but the idea that victory and trauma are often the same thing. The Marines' strategy became legend, studied in war colleges, replicated in countless conflicts since. But beneath the textbooks and medals lies a truth too often forgotten, that mastery of war demands a surrender of humanity. To let your enemy get close, to feel their breath and still pull the trigger, it requires something no training can teach. It requires the soul to harden. It requires men to stand still in the face of chaos and choose not to flinch. In the final minutes of that terrible night, as the fires dimmed and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the sea breeze, the Marines gathered quietly, their faces illuminated by the glow of burning palms. The sky above was heavy with smoke, and through it the stars flickered faintly, the same stars that had guided explorers, dreamers, and soldiers for centuries. One corporal, his hands still trembling, looked out at the horizon and said, "They never even saw us coming." His sergeant, exhausted and pale, replied, "That's why we won." Neither man smiled. They knew what that meant, that in mastering silence they had lost something deeper. But as they turned back toward the sea, toward the waiting ships and the promise of dawn, they also knew that their sacrifice had changed warfare forever. From that night on, no Marine unit would ever fight the same way. They had proven that courage wasn't about charging forward. It was about standing still until the world itself begged you to move. It was about understanding the enemy's heart so completely that you could destroy it with timing alone. And though the Pacific War would continue for months after Saipan, its outcome had already been decided, not by numbers, not by weapons, but by the quietest moment in battle, the moment before the storm, the legend of that night, when the Marines let the enemy come too close, became a symbol of terrifying genius. It wasn't just a story of 800 men who perished. It was a story of how patience rewrote the art of war, and as the world would later learn, in every battle since, from Vietnam's jungles to the deserts of the Middle East, the echoes of that night still linger. The lesson remains carved into Marine doctrine, whispered through generations. Don't rush. Let them come, then finish it.